Bum bum bottom 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 bum bum doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 bum bum bottom bum bum doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 doobie doobie da 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 bum bum bottom bum bum bottom ba da da 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 ba da da.
You are now in session with the Comic Book Couples Counseling Podcast. I'm Lisa Gullickson.
And I'm Brad Gullickson.
And each month we evaluate a different iconic romance within the four-color realm. Come on, Brad.
Huh?
You know you can't do that.
Huh?
No anachronisms.
Oh.
Public displays of podcasting are against the rules. Then again, who do I think I'm talking to? Gullicksons don't obey rules. They make and break them in our Creator Corner. We're talking to John Harris Dunning about Ripperland from Dark Horse Comics.
I love that intro. I did not look at the notes. I did not know what you were about to say.
And I did it in one take.
You did. My immediate reaction to that is to think about the few times that we have recorded video in public. When we were promoting Pots and Panels, a comic cookbook anthology, which will be arriving to Kickstarter backers sometime soon, I would go to, the Air and Space Museum, and I'd stand by the USS Enterprise model, and I would do like a little ad for our socials about Pots and Panels while I'm surrounded by tourists. And there's just nothing that feels more awkward and uncomfortable, maybe even slightly pathetic, than like recording a video for your socials in public.
Yeah, it's very vulnerable. I don't do it.
You've done it a few times.
I've done it, but it's not my favorite.
And we've talked about wanting to do more video for our socials in 2025. And I think we really do mean it, but it's very hard for us, friends.
The barrier of entry for us is just like, okay, first I have to get myself looking presentable, and then I have to have the patience for all of the takes we're going to do because we see or hear any of our idiosyncratic or we start microanalyzing ourselves and doing 1,000 takes.
I don't need to tell our listeners this, but I use the word incredible too much. I use the word garbage too much.
You should not arm them with this because now they're going to start counting.
And when I'm, editing the podcast, listening back to myself and I hear these things, I try to remove them. I'm like, oh, that's like my 12th incredible. I got to get rid of that.
That's the best thing about being the podcaster who doesn't edit because, I feel like I'm making ice castles. Like, I sit down, I have this conversation with my lovely husband, and then it just, disappears.
Yeah. And also, Lisa, what a difference a week makes. You sound lovely. You're over your cold.
Yeah.
Congratulations.
Why, thank you.
This is our last episode of January. I've been really proud of our January programming. I'm extremely excited about our February programming. We'll get into that at the end of the show. That's just a tease. And I'm really excited about finally relaunching our book club on our Patreon.
Yeah!
We currently have 2 book clubs going on at Comic Book Couples Counseling here on the main feed. Every month, we're talking to Rick Quinn and Dave Chisholm about Spectrum. The second issue just dropped. Our second episode on the second issue with them was last week. And then on the Patreon, we have decided to read Alan Moore's Saga of the Swamp Thing, starting at issue 20 all the way to the end of his run. It's going to take about 2 years. And we just dropped the first issue of that, and our patrons are loving it. Lisa and I are loving it.
Yeah.
Going back to Saga of the Swamp Thing, what an incredible comic that is.
The fun thing about doing 2 book clubs at once is my pattern-seeking brain starts finding thematic links between the two. And both stories have this alternate reality that is accessed through communing with something. So with Spectrum, you can access a parallel universe through music, and then Swamp Thing has the green, right? And now we're also going to talk about Ripperland.
Yeah.
And that creates another kind of parallel universe in more of a metaphorical sense.
Yes, I love it. Our Patreon, we just crossed a big milestone, Lisa. I don't even think you know.
I don't.
Unless you were paying attention to our socials, because I did post it there yesterday. But,
Never!
But we crossed 200 members on our Patreon.
Aw.
And that is, I think, 106 paid subscribers and then 94 free members.
Yes.
And I want everyone listening to know that even though we make the Patreon super cheap, for just $1, you can access hundreds of bonus episodes. Even our free members get tons of content as well. This month, we're launching a new series called Support Your Local Comic Shop. Every month, we are going to speak to a comics retailer about what it's like to sell comics in 2025. And those episodes are going to be free, available for everyone to listen to. And this week, we are talking to Eric Jones, the manager of Four Color Fantasies in Winchester, Virginia.
He's just great.
He's the best. I mean, we co-sponsor all our Alamo Drafthouse Comic Book Film Club screenings with him and Four Color. They do such amazing community work. Their outreach, how they get people from their community into their stores is inspiring. We talk all about that. We talk about how well their year went in 2024, what their biggest seller was, the biggest surprise, what their favorite comic book shops are. Like, for Eric, what's the best comic book shop in America? We talk about that.
Yeah. Four Color Fantasies does so many of my favorite things in a comic book store. Not only do they have front issues, is that what we call them? Like the current issues? That's what they're called. The new releases. They have a great front issues and back issues.
I got it.
They have a good variety of back issues on rotation in drawers that pull in and out easily.
Some of the best drawers in the business. We talk about them.
But they also do community outreach. They are a community center where people gather. They put the effort in to do real quality events with all kinds of creators, including cutting their teeth local creators. I just think that Four Color Fantasies is such a beautiful store. And I'm so glad that we can celebrate it and celebrate Eric specifically. He's not the store owner, but he's one of the managers. And he does such a beautiful job.
In our first episode of the year, talking about Time Waits with Chip Zdarsky and David Brothers, we were discussing some of our New Year's intentions. And one of them is to visit 50 comic book shops in America.
Yeah.
And in doing so, also support more brick and mortar stores and buy books from bookstores, not billionaires. And I think there are a lot of great opportunities right now to do just that. Today, actually, as we're recording this, bookshop.org, which is matching donations from the Bink Foundation to support bookstores and comic book shops affected by the LA wildfires, they have also finally made it possible for indie bookstores to sell digital e-books.
Isn't that cool?
This is major. All right, this is a great way to support your community, to support what you want to see in the world, shops that are selling your favorite books, not just some faceless online hydra gobbling up the industry.
We understand that this is not an easy thing to do, to kind of stop our toxic online shopping. The convenience is just so tantalizing.
And the price, right?
Yeah.
So it might actually mean we buy less, but where we spend our money, the value is larger.
Right. So what we're doing is we're changing our ways incrementally. We're starting with not buying our physical books online if it can be helped. We are going to more bookstores, but we're also sourcing less convenient ways to buy our staples. And we're not perfect. We still sometimes go to that site, you know what we're talking about, and we buy something, and it arrives at our door in that signature box. But, you know, like these small changes, if enough of us make small changes, the difference is going to be huge. I hope. Fingers crossed.
Another great news story in the world of comics this week is the launching of Sweet.
Yeah.
Our buddy Kenny, who was part of Omnibus, our former sponsors, he's trying to do something new with an online comic shop, the Sweet Shop. Also, the Find Your Comic Shop app, as well as the Bindings app. The Bindings app is designed to help creators promote their work in new ways. And I'm going to include links in this episode so you can go browse and take a look at what Sweet is doing. I'm very excited about their Sweet Shop once they launch that. There is so much potential there for that to be a new community. And Comics Beat did report on this earlier this week, and I'll include a link to that article in the show notes as well. But they talked about how there's going to be wish lists and reading lists and reviews, day and date releases, more manga, more young adult. They're even going to do a retailer affiliate program. So the potential here for Sweet is incredibly exciting, and I cannot wait to support it.
Just to underscore the retailer affiliate program, the way that works is you go to your local comic book store, and for one reason or another, we don't know why, sometimes this mysteriously happens, your book hasn't come in, the shipment is late. If your retailer sends you to Sweet, then part of the profits will go back to your store.
Yeah,
which
that's awesome.
I think is so important, because I know that like a local comic book store is not accessible to everyone, but I also know that local comic book stores are going to lose money if for some reason the distribution chain gets upset.
Yeah.
So this is a way that you can still get your comics but not be screwing a local business over.
What I love about Sweet is they also have the Find Your Comic Shop app that's launched now, link in the show notes. And like they are planning to work in parallel with the brick and mortar businesses. It's not an either or situation. And I just find that so affirming. And with the social media scene being so disrupted right now as well, it's just so important to find your hubs, to find your communities, find your Discords, find your Patreons. That's why we want to have these free options in the Patreon feed. We want you to come on over and continue those conversations that you may have done on Facebook or Twitter or wherever and no longer want to do so. Come on over to Patreon, come on over to Sweet, come on over to your local comic book store and continue these conversations.
If I may allude to the best comic book movie of 2008, Speed Racer.
Yeah.
We are all little speed racers. Yeah. We are not driving to win. We are driving because we are driven.
Oh,
we
man.
are not participating in the comic book community because it is our get-rich-quick scheme. It's because we love comics and we are driven to celebrate them.
Please, if you have not seen Speed Racer, or it's been a while since you've seen Speed Racer, rewatch Speed Racer with 2025 eyes. It is a masterpiece. We screened it last Sunday at the Alamo Drafthouse in Winchester, Virginia, and it was an awesome viewing experience, a righteous viewing experience.
Thank you, Wachowski sisters. You are an inspiration.
Now let's get into our main topic of the episode, Ripperland. The first issue is out now from Dark Horse Comics. It's written by John Harris Dunning and Steve Orlando, illustrated by Alessandro Oliveri, colored by Francesca Vivaldi, and lettered by Fabio Amelia. We first met John 2 years ago at New York Comic Con, and we hung out with him over at Christian Ward's table in Artist Alley for a long time, had a great conversation. We continued that conversation over to our Patreon feed in our Married to Singles episode. He wanted to talk about one of his favorite single issue comics. He chose Spider-Woman number 50.
This conversation was so fun, and that issue is wild. I love it.
I had never read it before. I still think about it a lot. And now he's got Ripperland. He co-wrote it with Steve Orlando, and we had to get him back on this show. We are obsessed with Jack the Ripper and Jack the Ripper stories. Ripperland has a very unique take on the Jack the Ripper mythology, or at least our relationship with the Jack the Ripper mythology. Lisa, give us the story.
The year is 2188, and America has conquered England and has turned it into a theme park of the Victorian era.
Yep.
But the way that it has done this is taken, like, removed all of the trappings of modernity to the point where the people living in England forget that it is the future, and they forget of all modern technology.
Yeah, they have no relationship with electricity.
Yeah, and because of this kind of hard reset in this tiny pocket of history, perhaps history has repeated itself, and a Jack the Ripper individual is tearing his way through this theme park / Victorian era / I don't know, little, I don't know. The idea is so out of the box. Like, Brad says we're obsessed with Jack the Ripper stories. That's more of a he thing. He was using the royal we.
Sorry.
But I am obsessed with time travel stories, Groundhog's Day stories, parallel universe stories. And I think that this is a really unique way to tell that kind of story and gets you really thinking about how, like, time is really, like, the present is really just a state of mind. The present is really just like a context. And if you change the context, are you really living in the present? Such a great idea. If you've been listening to the last month of Comic Book Couples Counseling, you have been hearing the ripples of Ripperland in the back of my brain. And that's because we had this conversation in December. And since then, we've talked to Chip Zdarsky and David Brothers about Time Waits, Tyler Crook about Mage, the Hero Discovered #6, and Rick Quinn and Dave Chisholm about Spectrum. And all of these stories, at least thematically for me, go back to the idea that you need to wrestle back the autonomy of your context. And how do you do that? You change your art, you change your company, and you do acts of service. And by company, I don't mean like business company. I mean like the people you're hanging out with.
Your community.
Yeah.
Yeah, so let's get John Harris Dunning into the love nest and talk about Ripperland. John, welcome back to Comic Book Couples Counseling. Hello.
Thanks for having me, you guys. It's always a delight.
Yeah. This is such a fascinating project, a fascinating collaboration, Ripperland. Can you walk us through the beginnings of this book? How did it happen?
It's kind of strange how one maybe looks for good things that came from COVID, because not much good came from COVID. But one of the things that happened to me was I kind of lost my comics community here in London, because obviously everyone was locked down and people had left London. It was just more difficult to get around and see people. People weren't meeting in the same way. And so I started reaching out to people who I admired, who I actually hadn't met yet. And I hadn't done an awful lot of visiting the US at that point. That was before I'd met you guys, and I'd started coming to New York Con, basically. So I'd really just been here in the UK and France. And so Steve Orlando was somebody that I just really admired, and admired because of the work he does, admired because of how early he started doing it, which was incredible. And just his voice generally. So I reached out to him and we just started chatting. And he's got such an incredible sort of get up and go. We really had good chemistry on the first call. And, he sort of closed it by saying, look, if you ever want to collaborate, come up with an idea, and just and get back to me. And so that was the genesis of this project.
And that is such a tantalizing offer to get, right? Like, well, if you have an idea, let's talk about that idea.
Right.
And then so, if Steve Orlando said that to me, I'd be like, okay, well, I'm going to spend the next 3 weeks coming up with as many good ideas as I possibly can. How did that good idea become Ripperland?
Oh my God, Brad, I was in completely the same boat. I was just expecting to have like a pleasant phone call. Like I wasn't expecting to end it with that like gauntlet being thrown down, like, let's go. So it was sort of a gulp moment, and then thinking like what we want to do. But one of the things that Steve and I had been discussing was just our sort of mutual horror at the countries that we lived in. Obviously you guys had been through your first Trump,
Oh
moment.
man, damn
And,
you.
and with all that,
Ow.
and what all that brought, and obviously we were going through Brexit, which was a really interesting parallel, and and both of those had their own impacts on the countries, and we were just sort of commiserating. And then from that, Steve was very, very determined that we do something set in the UK. And I have lived in the UK for a number of decades, but I'm actually from one of the colonies, ex-colonies, I should very quickly say. But South Africa. So I come as an outsider to the UK as well, and sort of view it as an outsider. And I'm really interested by how the UK is an American colony, essentially, and how if we are going to be successful in the arts, and this crosses music, it crosses cinema, it crosses comics, there has to be a certain, and TV, there has to be a certain like performance of Britishness to make it in the US. So it's like, oh, I have to be like Harry Potter, Muggle War, Bopplety Bops, or I have to be like fairies, or I have to be like King Arthur, or I have to be like Jack the Ripper. So that was a kind of joke, which is actually quite a serious satirical kind of political point, but then sort of took root and allowed me to think of like, what if England had literally become a theme park, which is basically post Brexit what England is becoming, because we don't have any industry and we've decided not to trade with any of our trading neighbors. So there's nothing to do but become a sort of Victorian theme park.
This story is an extrapolation from our dystopian present. And so the book takes place in 2188.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious, what is the math of deciding that year exactly? Because we're living in one of the best movies series of all time, Back to the Future. They chose 2015 and it was not nearly far enough. Like the entire cast is still alive, but we do not have
obviously 2188 is a reference to Jack the Ripper and the Jack the Ripper killings of 1888.
But what was your consideration to do like 300 years since then versus 400?
Honestly, it's a really good question, and I still question it because it's a really difficult calculation. I think because we are living in Back to the Future, it's like, I can't remember, you guys will probably remember, what date was Blade Runner, the first Blade Runner, supposed to be in?
Shoot. Yeah, I don't know it off the top of my head.
I think that was like the 90s, and you're just like, it's just always so wrong. So it was definitely this decision to put it further, because I think we always think we'll be further in the future than we are. And also I had this concept that it's slightly dystopian, and so that kind of hearts are dropping out of these cultures, so they're not moving as fast as they would because there's not the same optimism or same stability. So that's kind of how I came up with that. And then Brad, you're absolutely right. It was also just to resonate with the actual date, which was 1888, because it couldn't be 2088 because I needed it to be completely Victorian, but I wanted the 88, so I kind of just had to go that extra 100 years. So that was the math. But you're right, it was quite a difficult decision to make, because it seems quite flippant, but you do have to try and think it out.
2019, by the way, is the year that the first Blade Runner takes place in. So we have passed it, but relatively recently.
Yeah. And still nobody's dressing like Daryl Hannah, or not enough people are.
Sad.
Shoulder pads are coming back.
That is true.
And I'm going to start spraying a big blue line across the middle of my face and see if it catches on, but I don't know. May not.
It's a strong look.
What is so fun about this theme park that you have built in Ripperland is that everyone has fully committed to the bit, to such an extreme that when a murder happens within this realm, we cannot use modern technologies to investigate that murder. That commitment is such a fun choice. Where and why does that happen?
Guys, can I just say, I always love talking to you, because you really do. You always give me some real deep questions, which really make me think. Great point. Again, it's kind of like making a point about colonies and colonialism, because these guys are not committed. they've been told that the only way they can survive and be protected and be an American protectorate is not to have electricity and technology. So they don't have that choice anymore. And that's crucial because they don't even realize they are a theme park anymore. And that was the other point with that length of time. It's been like over a century that they've been living in this. So nobody even remembers what it was like before. And for myself, growing up in a place like South Africa, which was like during and post-apartheid, so it was an amazing thing to see that difference. When I think back to what I grew up in, it literally is like another planet. Like you wouldn't even believe if I told you what it was like. So you realize how quickly history moves on. That's in the space of my life, let alone a century. And so it's that thing. And so that commitment, and as you say, what started actually as a theme park for over 100 years, it's real. And it becomes something more sinister. It's more of a sort of colonial control than it is even a negotiation anymore at that point.
Ripperland, to me, qualifies as a time travel story because of this. There are two types of time. There's the time that we measure, which is linear time. And then there is the time that comes from our personal narrative. I was talking to Brad about this morning, and we talked about like Trump being reelected that second time. I took the day off of work on the actual voting day just to, kind of like veg out and kind of isolate from the anxiety. But then, so I missed one day of work essentially. And then the next morning, I looked at my phone and Trump had been reelected. And when I went to teach my first lesson of the day, it felt like so much time had passed, where that time would not have passed if I did not have that knowledge. You know what I mean? So like, I do think that this kind of like systematic isolation can turn the clock backwards on history, I think.
I absolutely agree. And yeah, it's a great insight because that's how it's written, right? Like when people go to London, our London is Victorian. I mean, even though they're making jokes about, the first Victorian period, it's essentially Victorian because as you said, there's no technology. The people are living in a way 100%, authentically as if it was in a Victorian period, including they don't have the right medical aid. They don't have any technology. They don't have, forensics, anything like that. So they are essentially living in another time. So you're absolutely right. And that is how we wrote it. When we were thinking about that space, the Americans coming from the future is how we kept speaking about it. Like, it wasn't as if like they're just coming geographically. They are coming from another time. Absolutely.
What
but
is the
you find that, sorry to interrupt, but you find that around the world when you visit developing countries, or that you feel like you're in a different time era. I mean, increasingly, a much superior time era, going backwards than going forwards. But yes, a different time.
I'm a person who actively believes in parallel universes. I literally think that every single person is a different parallel universe. Like that, like to me, that is a comforting and beautiful thought. Where like time that moves forward, the time that we measure is a construct, you know what I mean? What is the fascination with the Victorian era though? Because like that very much exists. Like there's the whole like steampunk thing, and then there are all of these people like, go through YouTube shorts throughout your brain. That way you're going to come across a half dozen, at least my algorithm, you come across a half dozen people showing you how to revert to the Victorian era. Why then? Do you think?
I think there's a few reasons. I genuinely think, and I gave this some thought over the period of this project. I mean, I love it personally anyway, and there's a lot of literature, and I love a lot of that weird literature like Algernon Blackwood and Arthur Machen and all that sort of stuff. And then I love the occult organizations at that time, the Theosophical Society, and of course Sherlock Holmes, all of that stuff. So I think I have a kind of genuine love for it. Why is another question. And I think it's because in the West, it was almost the birth, well, it wasn't almost, I think it was the birth of modern society. It was the very, very roots of us beginning, like, it's almost like if you went there, you would understand how things operated. It might not be the same as us, but it's not like you couldn't live in that environment or actually get socially what was going on. So I think it was the beginning of that. And if you look at somebody like Jack the Ripper, he's almost like the first modern man, like, and that says a lot. But in terms of, he could only have happened in this uprooted industrial period where people were living in a way that they'd never lived before, just crushed into these weird spaces in the city that was growing faster than anybody could do, uprooted from their families, where he could operate in this way, where there were lost people that he could basically cut down at will without really too much, without too much interference. So I also kind of see that as a sort of strange kind of dark side to the beginnings of urban living.
We've only read the first issue. We are in the stasis of not knowing. So I'm just going to speculate, even though obviously you know what happens.
It.
But like there are two possibilities for who this Jack the Ripper is. There is the individual who knows and references Jack the Ripper, but also in this turning of time backwards. If you can isolate a culture so that they go essentially backwards through time, would history then repeat itself? And like, what's exciting about this story is both are kind of equally interesting. Like, I could go either way. I would follow either story and be genuinely curious where it goes.
Oh God, I'm so fascinated by that thought, because this is just, it's really cool. We'll talk again when you've read it, but it's kind of both. Exactly that, because
I did not expect the third thing. I thought they were mutually exclusive.
Yeah, no, because you're absolutely right. I mean, I personally hadn't thought about it that way, but you could sort of explain it as both, really. Yeah, I mean, because I also sort of went down a bit of a rabbit hole. I mean, I know quite a lot about the Jack the Ripper murders, but then starting to do this project, I kind of started reading an awful lot about it, and got lost in a sort of rabbit hole. And it's really fascinating how, again, there's this idea that, is this some deranged lunatic who was, or is it something which is more structured and something which was done for a much more specific reason than just cutting people up? And that becomes really interesting. And of course, the reality is we can never know.
Right.
And I read such a good book called Everybody Loves Jack, which is a sort of giant tome of sort of 800 pages. And it's a really very subjective, but very well researched history of Jack the Ripper. And basically what the writer, who I think is the actor from Withnail and I think I'm right in saying that. No,
interesting.
This is his like masterpiece. It's one of his masterpieces. It's incredible. And but what he says was that in that period, as a highborn person, you could not really be investigated. I mean, it just didn't. I mean, that's how it was set up. Like the parliamentary system, you couldn't be arrested because it was too embarrassing for the upper classes, because they were like, oh, well, this must be a foreigner, or it must be, somebody like some minority doing this, because we are English gentlemen and no English gentleman would ever behave like this. So it was a self-perpetuating thing. And I think, Alan Moore plays with that a bit in From Hell, which is hiding in plain sight. I mean, the police force could never have exposed a nobleman because noblemen don't behave like this. Therefore, they're not the murderer. So it's so interesting what it brings up about class and people's perceptions. And there's I definitely play with that in both of us play with that in this comic.
So that is still true now. Like, if you are a rich person, you will not be convicted of any kind of crime.
Gosh, I don't know why you think that. I mean, no, there's no free. Oh, God. Oh,
yay. Yeah. Jack the Ripper, I think if you are a reader of any kind, if you're a history buff, but like if you're a movie fan, if you're a comics fan, at some point you're going to encounter Jack the Ripper. And I was trying to think back to when I first encountered his story. And I believe it was Star Trek: The Next Generation. There's like an episode that references
I remember that
Jack
one.
the Ripper. Yeah. And I'm wondering for you, like, do you remember a moment where you were introduced to this saga?
Yeah, I mean, funny enough, it's actually visual. And do you know the artist called Tennille, who did the illustrations for Alice in Wonderland? So he did the original Alice in Wonderland illustrations. Beautiful. You'll recognize them when you see them. He did an illustration which was in the year that Jack the Ripper
Oh,
broke in 1888, and it's called like the Spectre of Poverty. It's really scary, and it's this robed figure with a giant knife going through the East London. And I
hmm.
remember seeing that picture in a book and just being like, "That's really scary." And then
Yeah.
starting to read around Jack the Ripper, and it was a yeah, it was very prevalent in South Africa, which was a sort of ex-British colony. So sort of mythologies were very intense, especially mythologies of the past. And so Jack the Ripper was definitely a big thing. But as you say, he seems to remain a kind of trope that just repeats itself in all these different media, and he keeps coming back.
Yeah. And every 5 years, there's a book saying, I figured it out.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, and it's interesting because it's it's a little bit like it's a sort of David Lynch vibe, which is I think the point is you never want to figure it out, because if you figured it out, then it closes all the conversations down. So, but I mean, it is impossible now because too much time has passed. But I think it's more interesting as a conversation than as pointing a finger at somebody.
Yeah. And, as a comic book maniac, you've already referenced From Hell. At some point, people gravitate towards that tome from Eddie Campbell and Alan Moore.
Yeah,
And it's a book that I think was the first book where I was like, comics is literature.
yeah, yeah.
It's such a massive deep dive into that era, exploring class.
Incredible.
Um,
Yeah,
and
and in a way that only Moore could do, just such a well researched and just kind of insanely complex. I mean, yeah. I mean, I definitely can't parallel that very
well,
much.
that's the thing, right?
Ours is
Like
a bit
you,
more playful. Ours is a bit more League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, because I loved that so
yeah.
much. Like when that came out, I mean, Kevin O'Neill, who I met a few times, and he's just the
Uh,
ultimate gent, and he was so humble and just so. Although every time I saw him, I would just like embarrass the hell out of him by saying, he'd be like chat chat chat, and then he'd stop talking. I'd be like, "But you're the most amazing artist that's ever lived," and he'd be okay. But that aside, like chat chat chat, but you're still the most incredible artist. He was so awesome, and yeah, his that world building in that book is just absolutely like a masterpiece. You know.
Yeah, yeah. It's funny. We used to have a graphic novel book club, and it
Mm,
ran for like 8 years with basically the same group of people. And y- I chose Leave Extraordinary Gentlemen 1 month, and then many years later, I chose From Hell to discuss. And both times, even though those books are undeniably great,
mm,
both groups, both meetings could not deal with them. They
yeah.
did not enjoy the experience.
The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen thing was we had a certain contingent that was like, I don't like not getting references, which I think
Mm,
is like such a like a weird nerd stance. Like if I can't discern all of it, then it's not for me. And how dare this book? But From Hell was just a big chunk. You're gonna ask 12 people
yeah.
in
And
August to
it's
read.
and it's so
And dense.
uncomfortable.
It's dense as well. Like you actually have to stop. I mean, you can you don't usually feel that at comics, that you actually have to stop occasionally and just absorb, because there's just so much going on. Even though it looks quite simple, it's really not. So yeah.
But I do find it interesting when creators like yourself then contribute to a subgenre like Jack the Ripper fiction, and
Mm,
what it is like now, you to put out Ripperland, to add something to that shelf that will
mm,
inevitably be read by somebody just because it's a Jack the Ripper book.
yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, this is where the sort of joke becomes reality. It's like it's like the perform. The only way I'm going to get anyone in the US to like read something about England is if I dress up like Jack the Ripper or like put on a bomb. And then you do it, and you're like, actually, this does work quite well. But at the same time, it is definitely honoring that idea. And it just what I always say was, when Steve and I started discussing this, it just ran away with us immediately. Like it was written so fast that it was kind of incredible. It's not always like that with a project, but this project was like that for sure.
Part of the fascination with the Victorian era that baffles me is women who are obsessed with the Victorian era,
Mm,
because it was like such a like it was a terrible time for women. There were like
mm,
every time is a terrible time for women.
mm,
But like there is this kind of romanticized of like it was a time where women realized their power, but they had to be secretive about it, which
mm.
like is like kind of like a really sad
existence of female empowerment,
Mm,
but also
yeah,
like the
yeah,
idea like that Jack the Ripper, for women, Jack the Ripper still persists, right?
yeah,
Because Jack the Ripper is just a person who feels entitled
yeah,
to treat women like garbage and
yeah,
then throw them out in a way that is universally upsetting, and they do not care. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah,
And like when you're populating a story like Ripperland, and you have to have this consideration for, okay, well, I'm also going to portray women of the Victorian era. Do you have that? Like, do you? I don't know
So
what the
again,
question is, but
no, no,
like, is that a
I get the
consideration?
question. I totally get the question. It's basically how are you critiquing, and celebrating in a way like women in Victorian period because you've chosen to portray it and there's an attraction. So like, how are you doing that? One of the things I hadn't realized is that for a start, his victims were all women, but
Mm-hmm.
our victims are man for a
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
start.
that's true.
So that was the one twist that we both didn't even really question or talk about, but was actually quite necessary because one of the things that a lot of people do, and one of the things that everybody loves Jack do, is basically says like, for a start, I mean, I don't know how much you guys know about the actual history of Jack the Ripper, but none of those women, I think one of those women was a prostitute.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, the rest were not prostitutes. They were women who were just working class women, but they were called prostitutes because what a Victorian definition of a prostitute, well, is me basically. No, it's basically everybody who's dating, but is basically no, is basically a woman who is sleeping with somebody out of wedlock. That's a prostitute, and so that's how they were all defined as prostitutes. So even the fact that like after these centuries, like they're still being said like, oh, he killed prostitutes and sex workers. It's like, well, they weren't even sex workers, and a sort of celebration of the murders as we know now, because I think, we're all a lot more sort of, we understand culture better. It's not okay either. This is not a kind of jiving and playing with, oh, it's so cool, these are murder, and by the way, there were just some female bodies tossed aside. So it was a consideration for us, and I think you'll see when you see how the thing plays out how conceptual the murders are. I'm not going to say how conceptual the book is, but how conceptual the killing is in this book in particular. Like it's almost like a sort of piece of performance art. And that was a useful way of looking at it. It's not really so much visiting this rage on women's bodies. That's just not part of our story, but it was a part of the story. So it's good to see that and flag that up.
But it isn't also an act of rage, but it's an act of rage where like the first victim is a one percenter,
Mm.
and so there is like this eat the rich kind of aspect.
Well, and then I
Yeah,
don't want to spoil it here, but there's something on the last page. There's a cliffhanger
Right,
moment
right.
that indicates something else that I
yeah,
was
That's
not anticipating.
distinctly not Jack the Ripper.
yeah. I'm really pleased. That's fun. Yeah, we really went for it. We were just like, but hang on, why don't we just go further?
Yeah.
We had so much fun. I mean, the other thing that Steve and I had such a laugh with was just the two cops, obviously. Like,
Yeah.
you have one character who's this American guy from the future, Jesse Holden, who's like an FBI agent, and then you have Detective Edwin Fogg, and the silliness of that, and like we sort of started as our kind of like as like you do the American, I'll do the British, and we'll like really turn it up. But by the end of it, like we were just loving both of them and just jumping in and just throwing them into these situations and playing with the language, and it was really fun as well. It was a really cool way to do a collaboration. We sort of felt as though we had our space, and then, but I mean, by the time we finished the first issue, we're just like, okay, this is just our sandpit. Let's just go completely crazy.
It is so fun to see how it is so fun to be curious about how that partnership is going to like work out, because they both like because I live in the present, right? It just feels like, well, one is way more efficient. We all agree, right? One
Yeah,
is way more efficient than the other. But maybe I'm wrong.
yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
there's
Well,
some
we'll
kind of
see.
Victorian crime solving that goes beyond, well, this is my hunch.
Yeah, yeah,
And it could operate like a buddy cop comedy.
Yeah.
Like this could be, Riggs and Murtaugh.
yeah, 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 yeah. And it's
Fun.
referencing all those things, and it was really fun, I must say. And then I guess this artist Alessandro as well. He's Italian and he's living in Angoulême in France, and he kind of blew our mind. I'm going to, you know, and I've said this to him as well, but it was just like, you know, we were offered a couple of artists, and we saw his work as part of it, and we went for him. But I think both of us were still astonished by what he did, and I guess we'd seen his storytelling on the page, but I think the world building, like that bit where when he gets out of the hole, you know, that sort of
Yeah.
that train station, and just his kind of jazziness of his architecture and space, and kind of, you know, hat design on some of the women. It's absolutely hilarious, and just there's such a playfulness, and it feels a little bit like Kevin O'Neill. I mean, his style isn't the same, but there's something of that kind of quite exaggerated, but not too exaggerated. You still believe in the world, but there's something really energetic about the work. So he was another real kind of weapon that we had in our arsenal that we weren't really expecting. It was just a pleasure to work with him.
It's interesting. Before you said Kevin O'Neill, I was trying to think of who he evokes. Like, obviously, it's a very European style, but I do see Kevin O'Neill in the art, and I do see Guy Davis also as somebody that I was like circling around. It's very playful, but it's evocative of the era that this theme park is emulating, and it can also be shockingly grim as well. There's a page turn in this book where you're like, oh damn.
Yeah, you'll see we keep that up. There's definitely an edge to it, and we thought that was quite important. That's because I don't know what you guys feel, but you know, you pick up a book with Jack the Ripper involved, and you kind of expecting something quite extreme. I mean, this isn't extreme, like as a theme, and it's not sort of. I hope it's not sort of nasty, but that it's scary, and it's grim, and it's gruesome, and I definitely wanted to deliver that as well. There's some shocks in here, you know. It's kind of splatterpunk in some ways,
it's
and
visceral in the most like
visceral,
literal.
that's quite literally, as it turns out. Yeah, no, and I wanted that, you know. It's you. I think you saw in Summer Shadows like a different kind of horror, which is more sort of creepy, Ringu vibes. Whereas this definitely felt like, you know, there's some bodies being cut up here. Like it's about internal organs.
But it's not a bummer, right? And like it is very playful also, and there's a lot of comedy that comes out of the concept, and also the character dynamics of our two police officers. So to me, it feels like a very well-rounded book.
Great. I'm very pleased. Yeah, because for me, I think you can only get away with a gruesome with a bit of playful and a bit of banter and a bit of, you know, it's sort of the sort of Nightmare on Elm Street school of horror storytelling, or even Stephen King. Like in some ways, you want to anchor it in your characters as well, because it makes the kind of violence more shocking and more difficult, you know, than if everything's just brutal and grim. And then, you know, that for me, that's a turn off. I don't want to be in a world like that or in a space like that. I want shocks and terror, but not like, you know, and as you say, a kind of total bummer. I'm not interested. Yeah.
I read Steve Orlando's horror comic Party and Pray. Is that the title?
Yes.
And that is also an extremely visceral comic. And it is also extraordinarily dark, but has the kind of levity where you really love the characters and you want to see them triumph. You want to see them get what they need, their revenge or their whatever. So, yay, I'm in.
Excellent.
Yeah, now we just need the second issue, John.
That's right.
In the bag, guys. It's in the bag.
Well, John, thank you so much for hanging out with Comic Book Couples Counseling and talking Ripperland. The first issue is out January 22nd, which is either right now or soon to be.
Time is a construct.
Time is a construct.
Time is a construct. We're in the future and the past.
But seek it out at your local comic book store.
Awesome.
Thanks, John.
Thanks, guys. Such a pleasure to talk to you.
And there you go, our conversation with John Harris Dunning about Ripperland. The first issue is out now from Dark Horse Comics, and the second issue will be hitting comic book shops on February 26th. Lisa, how many times have we brought up our graphic novel book club or our former graphic novel book club and how it all fell apart thanks to Alan Moore and Eddie Campbell's From Hell?
Clearly, the wound is still open. We are currently and constantly in mourning for us to not be able to keep that comic book club going even longer. But, now we have 2 book clubs going.
That's right.
And we get to pick all of the books.
Yeah, and even more members involved. I do like that moment in that conversation about From Hell, though, where John Harris Dunning is talking about just stopping and absorbing the book, taking it in, and not trying to unpack it or be smarter than it, right? Like, just live in the book for a moment. Let it rest inside you. Let it rattle around for a couple of weeks before you condemn it or you celebrate it even.
Yeah, and embrace uncertainty.
Yeah. Be the kid who would pick up The Amazing Spider-Man in the middle of Venom Island storyline, not know what's going on, and just go like, well, I'm not exactly sure how we all got here, but this is cool now that we're here. If you have not read the first issue of Ripperland yet for some reason, and you have made it to this part of the show, let us encourage you to do so. The first issue looks, and this is another phrase that I'm very conscious of that I say all the time on this show, but this is how I celebrate comics. I find the comics that don't look like anything else on the stands. Ripperland is such a unique looking book. It feels like a proper European comic. Yes, Steve Orlando is there co-scripting with John Harris Dunning, but this is a Euro comic. This is the type of comic that Dark Horse Comics would import back in the 90s. Lisa and I, since David Lynch passed away, have been collecting issues of Chevelle Noir from Dark Horse Comics that collected his comic strip, The Angriest Dog in the World. And a bonus to collecting those strips in those issues is reading all these rad and weird and varied European comics that Dark Horse was giving to us back in the 90s, and they're doing it again with Ripperland.
I feel like one fruit of our kind of completely random comics collecting adventures, like trying to collect David Lynch's comic, is like you end up with a bunch of comics that you would not trip on otherwise. Like, it's so easy, especially if you're a person who is comfort seeking, to go towards comics that look like the comics that you already like. And let me just recommend to you reading stuff that doesn't look like you. Like, treat the world like your dollar bin.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, just if something looks weird, wild, different, and it tickles your brain in like a different sort of way, like, pick it up, read it. The worst that happens is you learn a little more about what you don't like. And isn't that valuable?
I think if you
valuable information?
Go back and listen to the earliest episodes of Comic Book Couples Counseling, you find 2 readers, Brad and Lisa, who were all about comfort reading, right? Mm-hmm. But in the pursuit to better this podcast, I feel like we have also bettered ourselves as readers. We've explored a lot more outside of our supposed likes and have discovered that we actually like way more. There's no end to the types of comics, the types of stories that we can like.
Yeah. Right now, our calendar is a New Yorker magazine comics calendar, and I feel like we wouldn't have bought that 6 years ago.
No way. And the reason we bought that is because we stumbled onto a YouTube short documentary about New Yorker cartoonists, editorial cartoonists, and you go, this stuff is brilliant. I need to reflect on it every day of my life. And now that we've added strips into our collecting habits, our reading habits.
In that spirit, right now we are trying to find some Richard Thompson comics.
Oh, yeah. Wow.
He's the guy who wrote Cul-de-sac.
Oh my God.
We watched an amazing documentary about his life. He was a really kind of niche but warmly received cartoonist. And then he got Parkinson's disease and he could no longer draw. And his strip Cul-de-sac became this kind of testament of what he was capable of and yet could never finish.
Yeah.
And we both used to work at Barnes and Noble.
Yeah.
And we would walk past his books every day.
All the time.
And now we are dying. We are dying for those volumes and we cannot find them.
They're out of print. They're not at our used book stores.
And clearly they're beloved because those of you who got them have kept them.
Yeah. I'm going to include links in the show notes of this episode to the New Yorker documentary and the Richard Thompson documentary. They are definitely worth your attention. Richard Thompson loved comics.
Yes.
And he made comics about comics.
Yes.
And I need those comics on our shelves. You can read them also online. You can find, little strips here and there of Cul-de-sac. And I mean, they are freaking brilliant. And I think with those recommendations, that's going to bring us to the end of this week's episode, the end of our January programming. We're so proud of these 4 episodes that began 2025. But just you wait. February is next week, and our February slate is jam-packed. Next week's episode is an awesome conversation with Jason Aaron and Mahmoud Asrar about Bug Wars, the new Image comics. These are the 2 creators behind, an excellent Conan the Barbarian run for Marvel Comics, and they have reteamed to do a little bit of a celebration of the types of stories that they wanted to tell in Conan the Barbarian but weren't able to. This is an R-rated comic. It's also a comic that's very much in love with the classic Sword of the Atom series. If you haven't read that book, you should do so. And I love these 2 creators. We've had Jason on the show many times talking about Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Absolute Superman. But it's now time to talk about a creator-owned project, something that's very dear to his heart, and to have that conversation with him, with one of his best collaborators, Mahmoud Asrar. So be on the lookout for that.
We kind of self-indulgently did a lot of our plugs up top, but we are clearly very excited about what's going on in our Patreon because we cannot stop shouting. But we don't want to forget to also mention our TeePublic store. We just added a new design by cartoonist Kevin Alvier. It is this beautiful homage to All-Star Superman, and it is also celebrating our theme for 2025, which is based on the Jack Kirby quote, "Comics will break your heart." Our theme is "Comics will mend your heart."
Yes.
It's about building our community. It's about making comics a more accessible and fair place. And it's also about supporting local businesses and all of that beautiful goodness that sharing comics brings. And all of our proceeds from both our Patreon and our TeePublic store are going to Bink. The Bink Foundation is a foundation that supports local bookstores and comic book stores when they are hit by unforeseen emergencies. Right now, they are supporting the bookstores affected by the LA fires, and all of the donations are being matched by bookshop.org. Please look up both of those organizations and learn more, right? That's good. You can give your money. You don't have to have a t-shirt. You can just donate directly to them.
Yeah.
But, it's a great shirt. I love it.
And bookshop.org is bringing digital books or the sales of digital books to independent bookshops.
Which is so cool.
And don't forget, on February 9th at 5 o'clock, along with 4 Color Fantasies, we are screening Conan the Barbarian at the Alamo Drafthouse in Winchester, Virginia. This is part of the Alamo's James Earl Jones celebrations, which is benefiting the Douglas Alumni Association that promotes education and growth for local high school students.
Is there another way to look at boobs and be of service?
No.
That is all of my interests coming together.
Conan the Barbarian is a great film.
Yeah.
Obviously based on the Robert E. Howard character, which became one of the great Marvel comics of the 70s and 80s. And we are so proud to have Jim Zub, the current writer behind the Conan the Barbarian comic from Titan, to do a virtual intro for us. He went all out. There are graphics, there are montages, there are effects, there's music in this virtual intro. It really puts to shame anyone else who has done an intro for us already.
Okay, Brad, great episode. I feel like I need a little R&R, some kind of recreation. So I think I'm going to visit the Middle Ages. So I'm just going to leave I'm just going to leave all of my tampons here. I'm just going to free bleed in the past for fun. Where can our listeners send their words of affirmation to you?
What a horror story. You can find me on most social medias at MouthDork, although you can find me mostly on Blue Sky these days. If you have words of affirmation for our logo, send them to Jesse Lonergan at Jesse Lonergan on Blue Sky or on Instagram at Jesse.Lonergan. Lisa, where can our listeners send the words of affirmation to you?
I'm always accepting words of affirmation at Sidewalk Siren on some social media. If you'd like to spend more quality time with us, you can subscribe to us on Podbean, Spotify, YouTube, Audible, Apple Podcasts, or whatever app you choose. We're everywhere. If you'd like to get exclusive, you can join our Patreon, where you'll get more content, including weekly bonus episodes.
If you'd like to reach out and touch us electronically, you can email the podcast, cbccpodcast@gmail.com. You can visit our website, comicbookcouplescounseling.com, or follow us on all the socials at CBCC Podcast.
If you'd like us to touch you physically, you can wear our merch. tpublic.com/store/comicbookcouplescounseling divided by hyphens.
You can give us a gift of 5 stars on Audible or Apple Podcasts. And if you'd like to do an act of service, why not write a review or leave a comment on the show while you're there?
We are fluent and receptive in all 5 love languages. It really warms our hearts and helps the pod.
So until next time, friends, keep your love tank full.
And your psychic rapport open.
Doopy doopy. Bum bum ba da bum bum ba da ba.